statistical data that's already been compiled. So you can find out how many Arab Americans live in Michigan, but you can't get their names, you don't know who they are.
Right, right. I want to take us back in history, and we've been talking about numbers and politics a little bit. I want to talk about I don't want to get too cosmic here, but the soul of America. So I turn to you.
The soul of America.
The soul of America. Could you summarize that in 30 seconds, please? You were backstage, you were talking about just how the census has evolved over the years and how it's kind of, I don't know, did it influence our identity or it reflected the identity?
I think it's both. I was doing all this research on the history of the census, and for many of you who don't know, I think most people think the census is about counting, and that's what I thought. It's really an exercise in counting before I started to do research, and I started to look back since 1790 of how we counted Americans along racial and ethnic lines, and back then it was color, and there was a controversy then, who should be counted? And should slaves who are black be counted the same as free whites? And because there's money involved and taxation involved, there was a big debate. The Northerners wanted slaves to be counted as the equivalent of free whites, and the Southerners didn't, and they agreed on a compromise that black slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a white person. So in that sense, the census not only cemented the color line, but reinforced how we thought of race, racial inequalities. And these categories have constantly changed, which is really fascinating. I was saying backstage that in 1850, we had a category mulatto to try to capture the amount of racial mixing between blacks and whites. In 1890, I believe, they added octoroon and quadroon to try to get at precise racial mixtures between blacks and whites. And then in 1930, because there was so much racial mixing, they actually dropped that altogether and just used black for anyone with any trace of black ancestry. And hence this idea of the one-drop rule, which has stayed so pervasive in the minds of Americans of who is black. And so as a result of all these practices, I think Americans have become very attuned to identifying blackness and constraining that racial category in ways.
And yet you said also.
The sun is where I'm at, blazing black, focused on the fact we taking this shit back. This is all we ask, get it shining, UV on the track. If we take it back, man, they used to call it niggas fat. Now we shaping that, times I've rearranged this in the past. I ain't faking drafts, yeah, I know this is shapes and crafts. In the previous video, we explored the use of language and etymology in relation to epigenetics and human consciousness. As we know now, many things affect the perception of a person, and perception molds reality, even on a cellular level. What one has learned throughout their life affects how they live it. So imagine, a society crashes upon a natural people, one which forces through violence and compulsory education an unnatural method of living upon them. How might these mysterious people act? Would they be considered healthy by the general population? How might their story be preserved if not already lost to the narratives forged in time? It seems a daunting question to ask, but there are a few sayings that replay within my mind often. The first being sources in everything, and the second being what has been in the dark will one day come to light, or so the saying goes anyway. Building upon that concept of change and reapplication, let us think about the term America, and by extension, American. Where did this word come from? What does it mean? Has its meaning ever changed? Like most words, phrases, and descriptors, the answer would be yes. The definition of the word American today has a stark difference in meaning than it did in 1828. Webster's dictionary of his day describes the original copper-colored inhabitants or aboriginals of the American continent as American, adjective, pertaining to America, American, noun, a native of America, originally applied to the aboriginals or copper-colored races found here by Europeans, but now applied to the descendants of Europeans born in America. Now, many people are confused when they hear the word America.
often believing it to solely refer to what we now know as the U.S. or United States of America, or the United States Corporation. Whichever one you know of and refer to it as, we can be sure that this is only one part of an American whole, nestled between imaginary lines drawn by Europeans who brought dis-ease and destruction through distraction. The landmass that is America had already been long inhabited by a varied and special people. These copper aboriginals are like those of Australia, or of most of the inhabitants of mainland Africa, or even the originals of Southeast Asia. Many of these people are of a Negro stock, with varying textures of skin and hair, and beyond the borders of the U.S. did these copper-colored people exist, up through Canada and down through Mexico and the rest of the South of America alongside the Caribbean, all of which are America. What is found on these lands, much like the Great Pyramids of Giza, are monolithic structures of similar design. It is more so beginning to be understood that these structures are found all over this abundant and self-preserving rock we call a home. As it stands, many people have not yet seen the connection that persists between the whole of the American continent, or there is a certain incentive for that information to not be readily available. As far as those that benefit the most are concerned, the original inhabitants of this continent simply disappeared, fading into a memory of smallpox and inbreeding. The brutality of it all is an historical afterthought. As they say, time is money and money is to be made today. And now, thousands of people flock from other land masses for this exact cause. And who exactly is the most affected by the colonial and imperial history of the U.S. in relation to the American continent? None other than the so-called black man, the African American, the Negro, the nigger, the Indian, the savage. He and she have gone by many misnomers. It is not to say that the globalist cabal has not used the United States to subjugate and miseducate the masses of the world. All of those suppressed under the imperial thumb of the financial system have endured much, but it is the American Negro who has weathered a storm like no other, forgotten under mountains of hidden images and paperworks, false and broken treaties, and dismissed under the illusion of prosperity and privilege, as if poison disguised as medicine has ever served anyone before. But still present today, lost in the confusion that is racial and race classification. And today, many would ask, why is it important? Race is outdated. We are all the same, many will say. America is no longer a racist nation. And to that I asked the previous question, what would happen if you take a people and flip their natural way of living on its head? How might they act when their identity is stripped away from them? When you build a lie on top of their graves and ruins, how might such a scenario create a lack of proper sense of self? What exactly is race? As a concept, what is the term black actually referring to? And how might this confusion play in the separation and unification of foundational black Americans, African immigrants, and Caribbean peoples apart of the diaspora and Negroid peoples? And more importantly, what then is the remedy? Well, first we have to rewind back to May 4th, 1493. Pope Alexander VI signs Inter Caetera, the papal bull written on behalf of their so-called God. An excerpt reads, "Out of our own sole largest, and certain knowledge and out of the fullness of our apostolic power, by the authority of Almighty God conferred upon us in blessed Peter, and of the vicarship of Jesus Christ, which we hold on earth and do by tenor of these presents, should any of said islands have been found by your envoys and captains, give grant and assign to you and your heirs and successors, kings in Castile and Leon forever, together with all their dominions, cities, camps, places, and villages, and all rights, jurisdictions, and appurtenances, all islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered and to be discovered, towards the west and south, by drawing and establishing a line from the Arctic Pole, namely the north, to the Antarctic Pole, namely the south, no matter whether the said mainlands and islands are found and to be found in the direction of India, towards any and other quarter, and said line to be distant 100 leagues towards the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as Azores and Cape Verde, with the proviso However, that none of the islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered, and to be discovered beyond that said line towards the west and south, being the actual possession of any Christian king or prince upon the birthday of our Lord Jesus Christ, just past from which the present year 1493 begins. And we make a point in dispute you and your said heirs and successors, lords and them, with full and free power, authority, and jurisdiction of every kind. End quote. Well, as clear as that may be, some people may still likely be confused. What does Inter Caetera and the Roman Catholic decree have to do with the Aboriginal people of the Americas? Well, this decree allowed prominent families of Spain and Portugal to send over explorers to chart, navigate, and scout out foreign lands. We all have heard of Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. In most cases, his depiction is of a European man, but Columbus was not the only explorer to sail to these lands. Another, Hernando de Soto, was one if not the earliest explorer to step foot on the mainland of North America. His expeditions consisted mostly of southeastern U.S., these lands being home to the darkest of the Aboriginal people. If we think about America today, the American South has remained this way, with the overwhelming majority of so-called blacks living here and having direct ancestry to these lands. Hernando de Soto would aid in the shipping and subjugation of American Aborigines to Europe sometime before there were any shipping of African people to the New World, and for good reason. They needed people who could be trusted to be sent back. One should ask how a colonizing people could come to a land they had no experience in, say, farm, without the aid of people who already knew and worked the land. A video game titled Greedfall displays a romanticized version of this history. It follows a native of this island who is kidnapped from his home as a child. He returns and is asked to mingle amongst the natives in order to find a cure for his adopted brother. The various tribes of these people are all inherently different, but very much the same. They have certain different customs, but are under much of the same cultural umbrella. This plot hits home in the sense that it reflects the real-life story of America, as well as other land masses to a T. But how then does this information about Hernando de Soto's unmarked slave trade have to do with racial classification? Let's take a look at the social caste or class systems of various cultures. Today, Americas can be broken up in much the same way as its ancient counterparts. Imagine a pyramid such as the one on the dollar bill, or a ladder. At the very top are career capitalists, those who have gone to prestigious universities. In general, they are investors and CEOs of major corporations. This is better described as the 1%. Then follows the upper middle class. Those are of college or university education who have high-level professions and upper management. Below this class is the lower middle class, people with some form of education and apprenticeship. These individuals are semi-professional and lower-level managers, most often of a small region or section. Below that includes the working class, poor working class, and underclass of society, those of $30,000 and below. These people make up a majority of not only our U.S. society, but the globalist nations as a whole, regardless of the so-called political leanings. Even somewhat communist authoritative China has capitalist leanings, as the global supply chains work in tandem to make a profit. Now, this caste system did not spawn overnight. The colonial caste system consisted of its own hierarchy, with those of pure-blooded Spanish descent at the top, followed by Creoles who were pure-blooded Spaniards born in the New World. Then beneath them were mestizos and mulattoes, people with either mixed European and Indian blood or mixed European and slave blood. And then beneath that were the pure-blood Indians and black slaves. Before we dissect these classifications, let us mention the ancient examples. In the Far East caste system, gods were the apes, existing a part of but separate from the caste directly. They were followed by priests and scholars said to be worthy to remain in direct communication with the gods. This caste is titled Brahmin. Below that are Kashtriya, consisting of warrior and king. Below that are Vaishya, consisting of merchants and landowners. Then beneath that are Sudra, commoners, peasants, and servants. And then at the very bottom are the Harijan, or the untouchables, those people who are often the most original and dark. They were given jobs such as sewer work and scavenged and considered street trash. In any case, What these systems have in common is a need for darker and original people to be at the bottom. It is dependent on a larger percentage of general population being ignorant enough to prop up the minority. These caste classifications also work to mentally separate those in between, allowing for many struggles of power from those in the same class, desperately attempting to rise above their current conditions while those at the top reign. Of course, in any society, there is a hierarchy of sorts, one that often must be maintained in order to maintain order, and for every person to have a pace and purpose. But the color-based castes of today are only work to keep a certain group above the other. There is little truth and fairness in its design. So, the United States, acting under the color of law, uses its color caste system to separate white persons from others. This is clearly defined in the system's classifications and descriptions of various races. Each racial group is described as the following. White, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Black or African American, a person having origin in any of the black racial groups of Africa. American Indian or Alaska Native, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, or maintains tribal affiliations or community attachment. Asian, a person having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including, for example, Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, Malaysia, Pakistan, the Philippine Islands, Thailand, and Vietnam. And Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, a person having origins in the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. What is distinctive in these classifications is that all of them pertain to the original people of a landmass or country, while as black omits the word directly. But why? From the description given by the U.S. Census, race is much more closely related to a classification, a status, where white is the top and black more or less is often the bottom. And as we have seen, the classes in the middle, mulatto, the same as mestizo, were removed over time as to broaden the classification and give it less specification.
In ways.
And yet you said also in that year, 1930, that they
Yeah.
added a category which I'd never heard of.
Yeah, in 1930 alone, Mexican was listed as a racial category. And LULAC, which is the acronym which escapes me now.
I'll help you. That's the
Okay.
that's the League of United Latin American Citizens. It's one of the oldest Latino civil rights groups in the country, LULAC.
Thank you.
We're here to
So
help.
they were very vehemently opposed to having Mexican as a separate racial category because that meant that Mexicans were not white. And LULAC, which was a very conservative organization at the time, was very adamant about this idea that Mexicans are white and should not be a separate color category, and aligned with blacks or Chinese or other groups. And so because of their protests after 1930, they were never listed as a separate racial category. And I think in some ways, because of that, the boundaries surrounding Mexican are quite different.
Now, there's a certain irony when you look at how Latinos or Hispanics or whatever we're being called today are categorized today. You gentlemen want to talk about that? We were discussing that quite a bit.
Well, everybody will be
Yeah.
asked two questions. Everybody will be asked to identify their race, and they'll have the options to identify themselves as either white, black, Asian, and there are a number of categories under that. Native American, where they can write in their tribe, or some other race, or any combination of the above. And everybody will also be asked to identify themselves if they're Hispanic or not. And then there'll be 4 check-off boxes. Are you, yes, Hispanic, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, or some other Hispanic, where people can write in their national origin.
Okay.
So that's asked of everybody in the country.
But you were saying that some people that you get all sorts of wild answers to that
Well,
question.
the thing is
historically.
that in the sum of the race category, about half of Latinos do not identify as any of the above categories, neither white, black, Asian, or Native American, and they identify as some other race. The problem with that is that OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, does not recognize some other race as an official racial category. So even though you're allowed to be self-identify as some other race, the Census Bureau will go back and recode you into one of the categories above. The Census Bureau will go back and recode you into one of the categories above. The Census Bureau will go back and recode you into one of the categories above.
You don't find that suspicious? You don't find that suspicious? You don't find that suspicious?
Some would say history is written by the victors, and in America, whether it is an illusion or not, we have lived the way they have told us to. We have taken their laws, their names, and titles and forgotten our own. We have followed another's path while ours is covered in dust, lost, though not totally forgotten. We stand now at the precipice of a changing tide. When once confusion shackled the mind, now many of us see, even if only a few feet in front, for they fear us because we see far. Many are scared to know, and though we have forgotten consciously, subconscious reigns, calling out for one's attention. The sun rises, and rivers rage. The trees breathe and the wind sweeps, and all stand firm, ready for us to reclaim it. To understand the self is to understand the nature of the universe, but everyone must start somewhere. And start we have. From sea to shining sea, we glimmer and await the call. So, how then can one search for themselves? How is this research to be done? If race is unreliable in proving one's origin, how then can genealogy be used to discover the truth? This research can be conducted online to start, and it is best to search through both mother and father's first and last names. You can then trace your family back through these lines using sites such as Ancestry.com for a fee, or FamilySearch.com, which is free, and uses some information found on other record sites such as this. Because these records were also kept via the church or U.S. Census, they can almost directly be tied to the history of slavery in this country. As we know, the Holy Roman Empire through papal bull gave colonialists permission to subjugate these lands. then used various churches and missionaries to remove the spirit of the people, just as they had done in parts of Africa. One can gain a much more solid record by visiting sites where the records reside, such as the local courthouses, historical archives, or the Library of Congress, though they will come at a cost. It may be much easier to start on your own until you can go no further. In some cases, you may have a large enough family that a network can be formed. In my case, my family has a Facebook group consisted of various last names, including Campbell, Walker, Briggs, Mouton, LaPointe, Washington, Nunez, Clark, and Coleman, just to name a few. With this Facebook group, I was able to narrow down the singular point of unification between all of these various families, the Briggs line. This showed me the paper genocide that had taken place, as many of my ancestors, specifically Eliza Briggs, began as mulatto, and over the course of 20 or so years changed from this to color, then to black. One could say that they were censused into society and given a changing social cast that reflected the ethnic mixing. The Briggs family being a Scottish family with the crest and everything. It stands to reason that through the Briggs line, the Scottish blood can be traced all the way to the 1500s loosely, while the line stemming from Briggs, especially my Coleman line, gets muddy and confusing. There are less documents and paper trail the further you go back. Inevitably, the more time you go, the less record is there. This is to be expected no matter what ethnicity you are after a certain point. So what we are left with beyond records? Well, at best, old maps and artwork. Many of the ancient paintings, engravings, and structures of the old world depict dark-skinned men and women in feathered crowns and gowns. Many would have you believe that America was a land of Asiatic hybrid Indians who have long hair, long noses, and pale skin, yet they rarely show those of the dark, kinky hair, copper flesh, megalithic structures that we see in this old world prior to their changes.
There were certainly undercounts in terms of how many people were reported even as black, because you can be multiracial and look phenotypically very different. So it wasn't until 1970 that you were given the liberty to mark your own racial status
that
and everything
recent? I
else.
didn't realize.
Yeah, and it was really because of cost.
But also, there's been an interesting history over how the census counted or did not count Native Americans. Could anyone explain what was up with that?
Well, in the first censuses, Indians not taxed were excluded completely.
Right.
And that referred to Native Americans who lived on reservations.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
But that has been changed. And in fact, the whole notion of the 3/5 of a person, a slave being 3/5 of a person, that was abolished when slavery was abolished.
Yeah.
I believe
So
it was
this
in the
whole
14th
notion-
Amendment. 14th Amendment was when it
the
was
whole
abolished.
notion of all people who reside in this country being persons really is derived from the 14th Amendment to the Constitution.
away from the narratives given by compulsory education. So far, we have learned that race is an indication of class, not ancestry. When it comes to deciphering the reality of one's own lineage, your own personal research is key. It may be difficult for one who is growing in a world of ignorance to find themselves in the wilderness of deceit. Like a child lost and alone, the task can be monumental. But don't fret. If not you, then who? Race as we know it has placed those of various mixtures under a single banner. This act on one level has worked to unify a diaspora of people, but on the other hand has removed unique cultural markers from a people through various forms of genocide. By researching one's own genealogy, you decipher just what happens to your exact bloodline, separate from narratives of his story rather than the real story. It can be difficult, though rewarding process of self-discovery that I myself have much further to go in gaining the full honest truth. However, what I have found so far has made me question a lot and make sense of much more. So search for yourself. Define your own story. For the one you forged from within the self is the one most true. And with time taketh shall be restored. This fight is not one that can be won through violence and strength, though those methods have their place. The indoctrination is far too deep for a unified body to be created. For now, all we need is a strong minority to set the wave in motion. For in these last days, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Until next time, the real story.